Ahoy, you salty sailors. Time to raise anchor and set sail for your best scrawny life. Arr!
Alright, a couple variations on the Clouser minnow theme here. We're starting with a size 4 down eye streamer hook. Now, one of the problems with the Clouser minnow is that the dumbbell, as the head of the minnow, can twist around the shank of the hook. So we're going to solve that problem by adding a monofilament keel. This is 20-pound monofilament that we've wrapped around the shank of the hook. We'll go under the eye and back down, wrapping it back down over itself along the shank of the hook, and that will pretty much eliminate any head twist. This will be a standard bucktail clouser with the addition of a flash collar. Once we've wrapped down that first stage of white bucktail, before we flip the fly over, we'll load some flash material in a dubbing loop and twist that up and advance it up to the dumbbell eye. Then we'll flip the fly over, add some strands of gold flash material, and finally the upper stage of brown bucktail. The extra flash in this pattern will make it visible from a further distance, and perhaps we might be facing some muddy water, a little bit more turbid conditions than usual. That extra flash will help the fly be seen. So there's our flash collar clouser minnow. The style of clouser that I most commonly use, however, is tied on a jig hook. And this solves a number of problems. It's my favorite variation of the clouser minnow, and the one I use the most. Tying the dumbbell eye at the corner of that hook prevents any sort of head twist and gives the fly a little bit of an up and down jigging motion, and it also ensures that it's always going to be hook point up. It's also quick and easy to tie, so it's my favorite variation of the clouser and the one I use the most. So we'll wrap that head in right in the corner of that jig hook. Then we will tie in some synthetic fibers, twice as long as what we want the final fly to be. Tie those in on the bottom, then simply fold them over the front of the fly and wrap them in again for the top. And since we're using all synthetic material here, it will shed water very easily. It doesn't overload the back cast, and it can be cast a long distance, and it can even be cast with micro Skagit gear, in a roll-based casting situation. So very versatile, very useful. My favorite clouser variation with the jig hook. Here are a couple different iterations of it. One with Wapsi Supreme hair, one with holographic flash tinsel, and one with glow-in-the-dark fibers. Fly fishing guide Alvin Dido has, in true guide fashion, simplified it down to just a single stage of bucktail on top of the shank. But he adds a few wraps underneath the bucktail to lift it a little bit, which gives the hook point a little bit of snag protection, but it also changes the shape of the fly in such a way that it could be a shrimp or a crayfish. I think he's based out of Texas, so a place where you need a highly versatile fly. You might be moving from freshwater to saltwater and so forth. But yeah, it could be a shrimp, a crayfish. If it's crawled along the bottom, it could be, if it's given a few a slow retrieve with some twitches of the rod tip, could be a leech, or some longer strips, it could be a minnow. So very versatile. We're going to set the dumbbell eyes a little further back, a little further down the shank than typical, And that will give us room to put that upper stage of bucktail in, and then yes, we'll add some wraps behind the bucktail to lift it up, to guard the hook point a little bit and to give it that crayfish or shrimp shape. This is still a size 4 down eye hook, but I've changed to a stronger, heavier gauge bait holder hook for this fly. We could potentially be targeting carp or large drum with this fly, so we'll need a little sturdier model. Of course, we've started with our monofilament keel to prevent head twist as usual. I've added some rubber legs and a couple strands of holographic flash, and I've incorporated that into the middle of the clump of bucktail. Now that wound up making the butts of the clump of bucktail a little bit uneven, and we had some fibers sticking out at the eye of the hook that had to burn off. So I think in the future I'll set the dumbbell eyes even further back, and instead of trying to incorporate the rubber legs into the clump of bucktail, I'll just tie them in first, and then tie the bucktail on top of it for a little cleaner fly at the eye of the hook. Now you may recall last fall fishing the drop back in the Iowa River between Alden and Iowa Falls that I wanted to downsize my flies and use a 5 or 6 weight rod rather than the 7 or 8 weight that I typically use. And in an effort to do that, I've developed a fly I call the Little Big Shot. But before you can understand the Little Big Shot, let's have a look at my typical, just a smaller version of my typical pike fly. Generally, I'm making an articulated style pattern. It'll have one of these 1-0 hooks in the back, and then an articulation shank in the front. In this case, we're just taking off the articulation shank and just tying on the 1-0 hook, and this orange tail pattern is intended to imitate the colors of the shorthead red horse sucker. That's a main food item for pike and large smallmouth in the Iowa River. So what we're doing, we're tying in these clumps sort of diagonal to the shank of the hook, and then folding one side of it back and wrapping that down to create these little V-shaped stages along the shank of the hook. Once those are in place, we'll take the hook out, the fly out, and trim it into a teardrop shape. And that's just sort of pinching the fly between your fingers, squeezing out the fibers a little bit, and then trimming everything into a teardrop shape. And we'll do that from a couple different angles. And we'll wind up with something like this, but that would still be rather difficult to cast with a 5 weight. Probably it would go on a 6 weight without too much difficulty. Certainly a 7 weight could cast it quite far, but a 5 weight would be real difficult to get any distance with that fly, and it would probably overload the rod as we're lifting the fly out, because there is enough fiber, although they're mostly synthetic, there is enough fiber there that's going to bring a fair amount of water into the back cast. So with that in mind, now let's have a look at the Little Big Shot. We're going to have just a little bit of a feather tail here, so it starts basically the same as the other fly, but a little bit of chenille, and then from there it's just twisting up a stupid huge composite loop. It was difficult. It was about all I could manage to keep that from just turning into a complete tangle. But the beauty of it, why we're doing such a large loop, and you may wonder, you'll probably say, well, that's not going to stand up to pike teeth very well, and that's true. It won't be a very durable fly. I'll have to replace them fairly often. But the beauty of it is that it can be adjusted. The fibers can either be trimmed in the back, made shorter, or with a good sharp pull, you can usually pull some of the materials out of the loop. So it will be able to be cast with a 5-weight because I can just adjust it down to the point that I can cast it whatever distance I want to cast it. Now, as you have seen in previous videos, I generally do not approach the early season walleye run the way most anglers do. They will generally show up below the dam at sunset and wait for the big females to arrive later in the night. But when you're talking about dark conditions as well as crowded conditions, it's just a recipe for someone getting injured if you're throwing fly fishing into that mix. And these are often steep-sided places, so we're using microskagit tactics and gear when we're fly fishing. So I mean, would just be a recipe for disaster if I stayed into the night and waited for the big females. So generally, I will go out earlier in the day, and the fish that are there will be small males, if there are any fish there at all. So the small males are there not only to spawn, but also to kill anything on the spawning grounds that might potentially eat walleye eggs. And of course, there are a lot of stonefly nymphs active. They're crawling along the bottom and coming out to hatch at this point. But whether these flies are mistaken for stonefly nymphs or dragonfly nymphs or leeches or minnows or what is not necessarily important. Some of these could only be called nymphs in the most strained sense of the word. But in general, we want them to be dark because of the sunset, the approaching sunset type of conditions, and just look like that they're something that could potentially eat a walleye egg. So a large nymph or a leech of some kind is kind of the general area that we're shooting for. Now I'm using, in this particular case, I've never tried this before, but in this case I'm using a size 10 Umpqua 60-degree jig hook. And my reasoning here is that it will not only help keep the hook point riding up to prevent snagging in the rocks, because all these areas of course are rocky, the walleyes being a lithophilus spawner, but also it might kind of act as a like a stand-up jig. That's the bead can slide into that 60-degree angle, and I'm curious about how the hook will behave in the water with that bead sitting up like that. So we will see how that turns out, but in any case, it will be something that the small males will attack. I used a section from the body feathers of a wild turkey to form the tail of that first fly. And the tail of this fly is also from the same wild turkey feather, just further down the shaft of the feather where the softer insulating downy material is. Have taken some of that and used that as the tail of this fly. That will potentially help the hook, the back part of the hook, sit a little higher as well. Let the front of the hook drop down with the weight, and that slow sinking downy material will pull the rear of the hook upward a little bit, hopefully. We'll see. Anyway, there's a couple walleye nymphs for the early season run.